students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS, IIT Roorkee. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. In this lecture, we will discuss about social movements, that is, two types of social movements which scholars have described as old social movements and new social movements. We will see what determines old social movements, what are the critiques of old social movements, and how new social movements have emerged not only as a challenge to the new old social movements, but also to further explicitly understand and articulate how different ideas about movements can challenge each other, can expand each other's ideas, their horizons, and what we can get at the end of it. So, to begin with it, let us understand what is a social movement and why social movements occur. So, throughout human history, we have understood that there have been movements by different groups of people who come together for a certain purpose or for a certain cause. Now, these causes could be of various kinds. These causes could be for positive changes, they could be for also for negative changes. A positive change could be somewhat like giving voting rights to women. A negative change could be like bringing back dowry to Hindu Indian society. Now, at the facsimile, the structure, it might look like who would like to have dowry come back, because dowry is an evil. So, if it is an evil and it has been discontinued as well as banned by the Constitution of India, not exactly by the Constitution of India, by legal processes which are structured through the Constitution of India, then why would anybody like to bring it? So, we will discuss some of these issues in this lecture today. Now, certain scholars have argued that social movements are engines of social change and they resist certain or different structures of power, which essentially means that without a social movement, there cannot be a social change. And certain scholars like Tarot, Alan Touraine, the Chaudhary have worked on these two understandings extensively. The second aspect of social movement is that can we understand social movement as a collective behavior, or can we understand it as a contentious politics? Now, when we say something as a collective behavior and when we say something as a contentious politics, are they binary opposites or they fulfill each other? Now, every time I speak about collective behavior, you can go back to my lecture on Durkheim, wherein he speaks about collective conscience or collective consciousness. And the same kind of collective consciousness is also spoken by Marx when he is speaking about class in itself to class for itself. Now, when something becomes class for itself as well as class in itself, as we will discuss in a moment, it becomes part of politics. Now, why would certain classes or certain groups of people come together to form a class or to become part of a certain class of politics or politics of class? There has to be something that is contentious, that each member of that group feel highly aggrieved about. Now, this kind of contentiousness has been understood to particularly in the 20th century dominantly through three frameworks. We can call them Marxist, Functionalist and Resource Mobilization schools of thought. So, the Marxists, they, as we have been discussing throughout this course, they look at class contradictions. The class contradiction between between groups of people who are part of historical materialism and who are part of certain structures of exploitation. So, you have the class in which, so, so you have the class in which there is one class called proletariats, another class called the bourgeoisie, and both of them, they are part of the same structure called capitalism. Now, this capitalist structure, how do we understand this capitalist structure? We understand it through class relationships. The bourgeoisie owns everything, the proletariat only owns their labor power, nothing more than that. So, in that sense, what we see here is that there is an inherent contradiction between the two, and Marxists understand it as part of industrial capitalism and class struggle, because this entire framework of class analysis is also part of systematic inequality. The only way bourgeoisie can reproduce itself is by exploiting the proletariats. Without that, capitalism as a system cannot reproduce itself or cannot exist. That is the reason why it is in the nature of this contradiction that a social movement needs to emerge, which would bring in challenges for the bourgeoisie and create a new system of a classless society. Because of which the proletariats would eventually lead these struggles, and the $1,000,000 question is, how do we do this, or how the proletariats are going to do this? Ghanshyam Saha and others have looked at historical specificities and discussed how labor movements and peasant movements have identified not only who the opposition is, they have also identified their leadership, the organization, and how do they network. So, leadership also comes from the proletariats. The organization could be in the form of a trade union for bargaining purposes within the shop floor. It could be in the form of political parties, or it could be something else. As we had discussed in the case of the Italian scholar Gramsci, the leadership could also form or come from organic intellectuals who would articulate not only the problematic, but also create organizational structures, and how these organizational structures can network with each other in order to gain a fruitful purpose. So, this is also to say that collective behavior is a contentious way through which scholars have understood social movement. The other aspect of this collective behavior is that why people behave in a way that they behave. Do they behave as irrational, spontaneous responses, or this collective behavior is highly rational? Because some groups of people are aggrieved, that is the reason why they are coming together, drawing their lesson plans, drawing what kind of method or what kind of strategy they are going to follow in order to achieve their goal, which is not irrational at all. That is the reason why certain scholars moved out of this irrational, spontaneous responses kind of theorization to that of a resource mobilization scheme. Resource mobilization, as Charles Tilly and Tarot have argued, brings to forefront what they call as contentious the politics and opportunity structures. They look at leadership and how this leadership is capable of funding a particular movement, and through this funding how a particular network can be created with the help of media. Now this media could be mainstream media like our general TV and newspapers. They could also be the new media in the form of social media, or they could be a very traditional media through ballads, through stories, through rumors. The classical example in the Indian context is how rumors were used during the 1857 first war of independence in India to spread the idea that the British Empire, particularly the East India Company, is using certain kind of cartridges which is not in favor of both Hindus as well as Muslims. And their chapatis or rotis were circulated in order to create a sense of togetherness. So that is a form of media that was not the heard of by the British. So when it erupted, they were taken by surprise. So the leadership, funds, networks and media, they all come together in order to create a certain form of resource mobilization for collective behavior. So coming back to Marxism and functionalist approaches, Marxist view, as I said, is based on class struggle, how capitalist exploitation leads to a revolutionary change. Now the interesting aspect of this is that will it happen automatically? And Marx and Marxists view it as no, it will not happen automatically. There are class contradictions, but most often than not, people do not struggle. They do not come together to struggle for certain goals. Rather, unless and until there is a class formation, they would not struggle at all. And this is the core argument that Marxists have posited. So, anytime anybody who claims that because there is class exploitation or capitalist forms of structural exploitation, a social movement would emerge, there would be class struggle, and then things will through a revolution, things will shift. It will not happen unless and until the politics is involved, or the contentious politics and political consciousness is involved. On the other hand, the functionalists like Smeltzer, they argued that social movements restore equilibrium after societal strain. So they would always go back to the example of French Revolution. So what happened during French Revolution was a societal strain that happened because the society was not functioning in a proper way. The people or the majority of the people, they were living under dire conditions, whereas the king and his retinue, they were enjoying a very luxurious life, because of which certain kind of activities happened. The empire or the emperor was taken care of, which led to the French Revolution, and after a few decades everything became normalized. In the Indian context, if we see, so certain scholars have looked at anti-colonial uprisings from this perspective, that particularly the early kind of Congress, the movements in which they would write petitions to the state or to the British state, arguing that see, we are having the burning of brides in the name of sati. Let us stop this sati pratha or sati system. Or they would argue that in your own country you are educating your people in science and technology, in reason and rationality, but you are not doing it here. Because you are not doing it here, so we are the remaining backward, whereas you have moved ahead in the transition of history. So we also want to have English education. We would also like to have advanced medical sciences and engineering knowledges. While this was happening at the level of elites, the peasant struggles were not listening to any of these kind of arguments. They would come together and fight, like the examples that we had discussed with Ranajit Guha, when he documents more than 100 peasant movements against the British Raj during the colonial period, particularly before the Gandhi became prominent as a leader in India. So, in other words, social movements can happen at the top, social movements can happen in the middle, social movements can happen at the bottom. And as scholars, as political sociologists, our job is to look at from where it is starting, how it is starting, who is starting it, and how it is panning out. When we look at the panning out of these movements, we can infer to them the reasons why they are happening. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to say what are the fundamental ways through which people are coming together, or what are the fundamental ways because of which people are not coming together. So, it could be because of economic operation, or it could be because of something else. Now, one of the severe limitations of both Marxist and functionalist approaches was that it entirely neglected the idea of identity, gender and caste issues, which will come in a moment. At the same time, most of these analyses were understood as the reactive, because there is class exploitation under capitalist system, that is the reason why people are reacting, or because there is poverty, there is mass neglect, that is the reason why people are trying to bring everything into order, like the functionalists argued. Resource mobilization takes it a little ahead, because it is all about reason and rationality, and how resources are mobilized in order for the continuation of a movement. So, it is strategic and it is rational, and the participants in this kind of movements follow the particular strategies and they are action oriented. Without action orientedness, any movement that is looking at resource mobilization cannot function. Next, when we look at it, we can also see that uh, resource mobilization has a very fundamental problem. The problem is that it is giving an overemphasis on the mobilization of resources. It is as if you do not have enough funds, if you do not have leadership, if you do not have the political structure and a political organization based on Weberian idea of bureaucracy, then a movement cannot occur. The other reason for this is that most of these scholars who are looking at the old social movements, they are looking at class based, political party based movements, and many of them are looking at how the left parties organized certain kind of movements. So, left parties had a particular bureaucracy which was followed to its logical end. So, they would have a charter of demands 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they would argue that these demands need to be fulfilled. Only when these demands are fulfilled, we would come to the negotiation table, or we would come back to work. Now, as many scholars have argued, all these movements were not happening on the shop floor only. Rather, many of these movements were happening outside of the shop floor. That is where the idea of new social movements emerged, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s with civil rights movements as well as students movement of 1968-69. Then came the feminists and the environmentalist groups who looked at not just redistribution but also recognition. Civil rights questioned the racial segregation of people in United States as well as caste segregation of people in the Indian subcontinent. Environmental movements questioned not only the capitalist West but also the socialist East, as well as the non-aligned movement groups. And feminists, they argued that irrespective of wherever you are living in, the women are always suppressed as a group. So the recognition of these different groups became crucial for the emergence of new social movements because identity became an issue. And the focus on identity was also on a focus on post-industrial societies. Interestingly, it is post-industrial for whom? It is post-industrial for the modern West, not for the East or for the South, because the South was not so industrial in the first place. When the West became post-industrial, that means most of the manufacturing industries were shifted to the east, to China, to Southeast Asia, to South Asia, as well as similar kind of places. So the idea of environmental movements became very specific here because the people who are participating in these movements, they were against the destruction that was happening because of the atomic bomb testings, something that was happening because of all the effluents that were flowing to the rivers, to the lakes, to the seas and to the oceans. Plus, at the same time, the climate change was becoming a big issue among people. So what started off with civil rights in the United States, it took into consideration all the other aspects of identities that were crucial. So Alan Touraine, Melucci, Jürgen Habermas and all of them spoke about it and argued that identity is crucial, and unless and until we identify which are different kind of ideological and identity collectives, we cannot understand classes, because class is only one of many factors. And if we are focusing only on class issues, that means we are leaving aside every other issue. In the Indian context, we see the emergence of feminist, Dalit feminist as well as ecological movements from the 1960s onwards, whether it is Narmada Bachao Andolan, whether it is Chilika Bachao Andolan, or you can name any kind of Bachao Andolan. The Dalit recognition of not only identity also becomes specific here, because it was understood that even if certain Dalit individuals have gone on to become entrepreneurs, leaders, so on and so forth, but still they are not getting the recognition through their own merit. Rather, everybody else is speaking about it in terms of reservation. Same goes with the feminists, and the feminist movement here also started not just as somebody being a woman, but also what are the feminists, how gender is performed, how gender is socially constructed. Why is it that young brides are getting killed? Are they getting killed, or they are committing suicide? If they are committing suicide, is this actual suicide or there is something else to it? So this way what we see is a plethora of issues emerging at the same time in order to go and move beyond class identities and class classifications. Touraine, particularly in his 1981 book, looks at social movements as part of a historical framework in which is talking about how movements control social change. And these social changes are not just about material production but also conflict over symbolic resources like somebody's identity to be identified as a third gender. So identification of a third gender did not come because of the somebody's the good heartedness, rather it came through continuous struggle. That is the reason why he gives this three identifying criterion. First is identity as to who we are, who we oppose, and what is the vision of society. And these movements need not be based on a particular organization, need not be based on particular the structure, rather they could be as loose as a crowd. And this crowd, when they come together as part of a particular identity, that is what gives strength to this movement. That there is no requirement of a bureaucracy like the Occupy Wall Street movement. There were no identifiable leaders, but they all came together and for almost a year they worked very hard to get whatever they wanted. So collective identity, not just class identity, is at the heart of new social movements, as Melucci would argue. And how you feel about yourself, what are your immediate concerns, and what is your politics is what shapes new social movements. So Maitri Chaudhary has argued that while new social movement as a school of thought, as a particular strand of understanding social movements, has looked at the post materialist values like quality of life, human rights, so on and so forth, and it has also decentralized network and networked horizontal structures. The biggest problem lies in an overemphasis on culture and neglect of material inequality. Secondly, the way it was articulated, it was framed as part of a post-industrial society. How do you operationalize a concept that has its origin in a post-industrial society when you are not even fully industrialized? How do you speak about issues related to what is happening on the shop floor when you are not even part of that shop floor? How about looking at the issues of third gender when even the second gender, when women themselves and their work is not being recognized? So India presents, particularly not just India but also global south, uh, uh, represents a certain critique of new social movements that are structural as well as that are for everybody to see. Now, when in the Indian context, classical and new social movement theories, they kind of blur old versus new. Why? Because whether it is Dalit movements, feminist movements, or anti-poverty movements, they all bring together both material and symbolic values. So while Dalit movements speak of land rights, they also speak about dignity. And Ambedkar is one of the most important figures here who has tried to bring a breach these two. So mostly in the context of Maharashtra, the ideology that is or the argument that is framed here, it's called Dalit Marxism, because they are bringing material and symbolic the aspects together. The feminist movements in India have also looked at wage inequality and cultural resistance to patriarchy. Without that, feminist movements do not speak of anything else. Anti-poverty movements have also spoken the same language. Narmada Bachao Andolan has also spoken in the same terms. So what do we do here? Maitri Chaudhary and others have argued that when we speak of old social movements, when we speak of new social movements as two binaries, we are not looking at how the society functions, how an Indian society functions. Rather, what we need to do is that we need to disrupt these two binary categories and create a synthesis which would be plural, context specific. And social movements need to be understood as moral and political projects of justice. So, these are some of the questions that we can discuss, and these questions also follow the lecture that I just had. So, some of the works that I spoke about today are here, and there are also certain new works which you can go through. Thank you.